Welcome. In this blog, I like to talk about the brain, the gut, and the immune system. And are they connected? And the short answer to that question is yes, indeed they are. If you really understand what I'm going to talk about next, this could be a little bit of a longer blog and video. Then you'll understand A, the foundation of the diseases of aging, why so many of these occur, and B, the substrate or the foundation of the starting point for Alzheimer's and dementia. So in my book, Preventing Alzheimer's in Just 10 Minutes a Day, I talk a bit about brain inflammation and how I work backwards, as I shared with you, how I started looking at inflammation in the head and found out that prior to that, there was inflammation in the body that then overflows into the brain. So when you understand what connects the body and the brain, we almost always have to talk about the brain, the gut, and the immune system. And I thought I would use one example as a practical way to explain how all these factors are interconnected. Something I talk about in the book, and it's called metabolic syndrome. And what is metabolic syndrome? Well, it's something that about 25% of all of us Americans have. And basically what metabolic syndrome is any doctor will tell you, it's kind of the perfect storm and the meeting of three key factors. And those key factors are high blood pressure, obesity, and high blood sugar. There are some other factors in terms of LDL and HDL, triglycerides and that, but I like to focus just on high blood pressure, obesity, and high blood sugar. And the reason why this is such a key, because 25% of all Americans, or 75 million people, have this, is that they are precursors and risk factors for diabetes and heart disease. So this is why this is such a big thing when people talk about this. Now, I want to talk about also just one other thing. Besides those numbers, 40% of all people in an Alzheimer's unit have diabetes. So there's some, what we call an osteopathy, lesional chain between something like metabolic syndrome and diabetes and heart disease, and even what a lot of functional medicine doctors are calling Alzheimer's is type 3 diabetes. So they're connecting the dots. And I'm just using this as an example to show you how the brain, the gut, and the immune system are interconnected. So let's take all of these factors one at a time to see how they actually impact the gut, the body, and the head. So first thing is high blood sugar. Now it turns out that high blood sugar in the body is mirrored in the brain. And there's something called insulin resistance. So what starts to happen is that sugars in a normal way, as my functional medicine talks about, is normal. But in high concentrations, sugar is toxic. And unfortunately, a lot of the foods in American diet are filled with sugar in ways we don't even realize. They're put in everything. Makes things taste better. So that's the problem, is sugars in a high concentration can be toxic. So what starts to happen when there's an excess of sugars? Insulin resistance, almost like the body's trying to protect itself, raises in the blood. And it makes it harder for the body to absorb glucose, which is necessary for proper metabolism. So then what happens over time, this may take some time to build, but over time, that's why a lot of people are pre-diabetic before they bridge into diabetic officially. So what happens over time is that the system needs a little extra insulin. And that's why you have to take insulin to help combat diabetes. This is a very simplistic way to put it, but you get the idea. Now, in terms of connecting the gut to the head, there's something called the blood-brain barrier. So what can happen is that this insulin resistance in the body is mirrored and over time reflected in the brain. So the brain reflects this insulin resistance as well. And it means it's not able to absorb the glucose products which help the brain function. And unfortunately, about 60% of all the glucose in the body is absorbed in the brain. So when there's a high level of insulin resistance in the brain, it's like the brain is starving in a sea of plenty. It can't absorb the glucose and the nutrients that it needs as fuel to function. So the brain starves in that way. So that's, you can see a problem in terms of insulin resistance being reflected in the brain. So that's one aspect. Now, another is in high blood pressure. This affects the vascular system, which is also reflected via the blood-brain system in the brain. If you have a higher blood pressure, that's going to affect over time the vascular system, which means that in terms of the body and the brain, there can be potentially less circulation if there's a stroke or other cardiac incidents. And what it means is that the brain then becomes deoxygenated. So besides not being able to utilize the glucose it needs, it also has more of a starvation of the vital oxygen it needs to function as well. So you can see that would be a risk factor and a problem that's reflected via the blood-brain barrier into the brain itself. And then there's obesity. Now, obesity has its own problems because when someone's overweight and they have an excess of adipose tissue in the body, this creates more of a vascular system. It puts more of a load on the circulation. And obesity, it turns out, also creates its own inflammatory response. So the inflammatory response in the body, again, is also mirrored in the brain. So when you have a metabolic syndrome situation occur, it's like the perfect storm. And the perfect storm in this case is like a triple whammy. In a way, what occurs potentially is that the brain, first of all, is starved of glucose. So it doesn't have the nutrients to function effectively. Secondly, if there's a vascular component, it gets starved of oxygen. And so brain cells in that case can actually die. And thirdly, because you have an inflammatory response in the brain, what occurs is that the brain tissue becomes aggravated and it creates also its own inflammatory response. Now, within the brain itself, there's structures within the brain called microglia. They're like the immune system's own part of its system that's set up shop from birth. They're preset in the brain, these microglia. When the microglia detect an inflammation in the brain, they start to go to work. They're generally just passive and monitoring. But when they basically detect an intruder, then they'll actually start to go into high gear and create their own inflammatory response. If the inflammatory response is too egregious, then it invites other immune system factors across the blood-brain barrier, and secondly, puts more of a load on the immune system. And what can happen in Alzheimer's at the end point is, in a way, Alzheimer's is a little bit like an autoimmune response. If the inflammatory response is too strong, the brain literally, over a long period of time, begins to digest itself, which is not a very happy thing to think about in that long, slow walk to the grave. But if you understand all these gut components, as I mentioned before, the gut also manufactures about 90% of all the serotonin. It manufactures a majority of neurotransmitters in the brain. So if there's inflammation in the body, then that affects neurotransmission as well. So you have several factors really working against you when you see how the gut can be challenged. Starvation, deoxygenation, inflammation, interference with our hormonal problems, and also an over and inappropriate activation of the immune system itself. So as a way of looking at that, when you understand how all these systems are interconnected fundamentally, you can see why the body being aggravated comes prior to even any brain problems. So I know this is a lot to absorb, so to speak, but if you understand fundamentally the interconnections with all these systems, it makes sense that in looking at the body, and especially in the brain and the gut, then you'll get a clearer understanding of how to look at all these systems together and how we can approach them. This is exactly what we're doing in our CranioSacral campaign in preventing Alzheimer's and even reversing the aspects of this disease over time. So thanks for letting me share this with you. Very interesting subject. You can read more about this in the book, of course, and in other materials we publish. So thanks for listening, and thanks for being open to more of this education in this subject. Thanks.